Hey everyone, welcome to the DFS podcast for UFC Fight Island 7, Holloway versus Kattar, where I'll be breaking down, predicting, and analyzing the full card from a DFS perspective. We'll be going over things like fighter salary and whether or not they're GPP or cash game viable, and kind of just predicting how the fight will score from a DFS standpoint. Uh, First thing I do want to mention though is this is primarily going to be for Draftkings. The scoring and pricing for FanDuel is pretty similar, but if anyone is interested, I can go ahead and start breaking those down as well in upcoming podcasts. And something else I did want to mention is that the scoring for DraftKings did get updated, so significant strikes did effectively drop from zero point 0.4 to or zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.4 points, but they are also counting regular strikes now in the scoring, and those are going to count for zero point 0.2 points per strike. Overall, I think this should benefit strikers a little more, especially ones that tend to be a little more volume but aren't really landing those significant strikes. But really, I guess it just comes down to how Fight Metrics really scores the what's a strike and what's a regular strike and what a significant strike is. Something else they did add is control time, which is going to count for zero point zero 0.03 points per second, which will help the positional wrestlers a bit who really like to grind up against the cage or hold their opponent on the mat. And also plus 25 points for a quick finish, and that's something they classify as getting a finish within the first 60 seconds of a match. And lastly, they did remove positional advances, which will kind of mess with grapplers, primarily like BJJ practitioners who are looking to advance positions all the time, like moving into half guard or full guard or even trying to take the back. But overall, though, I don't think it's going to affect too many fighters, since the majority of them are either going to be strikers or wrestlers who are just positionally holding their opponents down. So overall, I don't think it'll have too big of an impact for most fighters, and it shouldn't really affect too much of our analysis, how fights were previously scored prior to the rule changes or the scoring changes. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's go and start breaking down some of these fights here. And in the first fight, we have Jacob Kilburn, who's priced at 7,200 versus Austin Lingo, who's priced at 9,000. I think this is a really good fight to target for GPP, mainly because both fighters are live for the KO. They're both pretty low-level fighters, have pretty bad defense, and have quite a bit of power in their hands. However, I do favor Kilburn a little more just because of the price tag, and because I actually think it'll be a pretty close fight on the feet. So you're saving a lot of money, a lot of salary, by taking Kilburn. But Austin Lingo isn't a bad pick, especially since he does have knockout power as well, and he could be a decent pivot play, since I have a feeling a lot of people are either going to be on Buckley or Holloway for the pay up option. So if Lingo does get that early KO, he could be live, or he could pay off that price tag pretty easily, and there isn't going to be too much exposure to him at the higher end. However, my biggest concern for Kilburn is his lack of ground game. He has shown time and time again that if he gets taken down, he won't be able to do much. There have been a couple of fights where he's just been taken down and was just on his back the whole fight. But with that being said, though, I don't think Austin Lingo is the type of fighter to implement a wrestle-heavy game plan. I just haven't seen him really do that just yet. So with that being said, though, I think that if the fight stays standing, it should play out very close, and both guys should be live for the KO here. And as far as cash games go, I would avoid this fight as there's just too much variance, and it is a really low-level fight. There's a good chance that either fighter could get knocked out, and I wouldn't want to have either of them in my lineup if they do, as it is the first fight of the night, and you wouldn't want the rest of your picks to have to carry the weight of this fight. So to recap this fight, I think it is GPP viable for both fighters, with Kilburn being a solid salary saver and Austin Lingo being a good pivot play. But I would avoid both guys in cash games, as it is just too much variance and too unpredictable. And in the next fight, we have Sarah Moras, who's priced at 9,100 versus Vanessa Melo, who's priced at 7,100. Moras is an easy fade for me for GPP. In fact, I actually won't have any exposure to her at all at GPP. I just don't think that she has the skill or the power to really get Melo out of there early, and I don't think she'll have the volume either over the course of a 3-round fight to really pay up, or for her to really pay off that price tag. As bad as Melo is, she's fought way better competition, and she did take him to a decision. So I just don't see Moras being able to get Melo out of there outside of a really fluky like armbar. But outside of that, I just don't see a way for Moras to really pay off that 9,100 price tag. And from a technical standpoint, I just don't think Moras will offer much on the feet or the ground for that matter. She really just has that overhand right that she throws a lot. And this is WMMA, so even at that higher level, it's hard to get knockouts, let alone someone like Sarah Moras. So I just think she'll have a really hard time getting Melo out of there. For Melo, though, I think she might be GPP viable somewhat, since she does have quite a low price tag on her, and I honestly don't think that there is that big of a skill difference between the two. So if it stays standing, I think Melo could potentially outland Moras on the feet. I mean, she could throw the volume and really have a chance of stealing the fight. And if that happens, I think she'll more than pay off for her price tag. Especially in WMMA, I don't know how they score some of the strikes and significant striking, but it seems they always score really generous with it. So with that being said, though, Melo is a very low-level fighter, and I wouldn't go too crazy on this fight because Melo did get dominated in her last 3 fights, and while we don't know how good she might be, we definitely know how bad she could be. So, very, very high variance fight. I wouldn't go too crazy, on it, but I wouldn't mind taking a shot on Melo as a GPP play. As far as cash games goes, this is pretty similar to the Kilburn Lingo fight, where it's just too low level and too much variance. You could very well have either fighter just not scoring well at all and leaving the rest of your lineup to do all the work. As far as cash games go, though, Moras is still an easy fade for me. Melo, on the other hand, might be somewhat viable because of the potential volume she could throw and that the fight could play out pretty close. If she wins, she could definitely pay off that price tag, and even if she loses, I don't think she's going to be an absolute lineup killer. She'd probably still get you like maybe 20, 30 or so points. So as long as your other fights are scoring well, you could still cash. I mean, you could probably even get away with one other fighter losing and cashing as well in cash games. And once again, this is a low level fight, so there is a lot of variance in this fight. I wouldn't recommend it, but I wouldn't be too opposed to putting Melo in there and maybe going with like a mid range kind of build with Melo. So to recap, I'd say Moras is an easy fade for both cash games and GPP, while Melo is somewhat viable for both, but don't go too crazy. And in the next fight, we have David Zawada, who's priced at 7,000 versus Ramazan Emeev, who's priced at 9,200. And right off the bat, I think it's going to be an easy fade on Emeev for GPP and for cash. Emeev just isn't a very high output fighter and doesn't really seem to have finishing potential. In most of his fights, he only averages about 80 points per win, so he's not going to do too well from a DFS perspective. Emeev has a really wet blanket sort of approach in his fights. On the feet, he doesn't throw too much and will usually just secure a takedown at the end of the round to help really just secure the round and win the round in the judge's eyes. Usually with low output fighters, they're trying to conserve their energy to land that kill shot, whether it's like a counter shot or an overhand, but that's not really the case with Emeev here. He doesn't really have devastating power and hasn't really shown any KO potential in the UFC. And as far as the ground game goes, I think Zawada is a competent enough BJJ in BJJ to fend off the submissions. And if anything, I think Zawada might be live for a submission if Emeev isn't careful with his takedowns. So overall, I just don't think Emeev is a really good option for GPP at all. His low output and lack of finishing potential just makes it really hard for me to want to pay up for him at that price. And as far as cash games, though, I would likely avoid Emeev too. At that price, I think there are just safer options because if Zawada is able to stay busy either in the clinch or just by throwing leg kicks, I think he could potentially outscore Emeev on the judge's scorecard. So for overall, I would just avoid Emeev for GPP and for cash games. Zawada, on the other hand, I don't think is a terrible pick for GPP because I do think he has potential submission upside. If Emeev isn't careful with his takedowns, he could find himself in a guillotine or possibly in like a triangle choke. Zawada does have a decent submission game. He did get that submission against Abu Bakar Nurmagomedov. It was a little fluky, but it has shown that Zawada is pretty slick on the feet, and if you're not careful, he could snatch up a submission. And as I've said before, I think Zawada could potentially steal a decision if he's the busier fighter on the feet. However, I think this is a little difficult since I do think Emeev is the more technical fighter standing. And as far as cash games go, though, I would avoid Zawada as well because there's a good chance that Emeev might just push Zawada up against the cage or just take him down and lay on top of him for extended periods of time, leading to Zawada not being able to score at all. So overall, I would likely avoid Emeev in both cash and GPP games, and wouldn't be a terrible look to have Zawada in a few GPP lineups. And in the next fight, we have Justin Tafa, who's priced at 7,600 versus Carlos Felipe, who's priced at 8,600. And while I understand why people might play Tafa because of his price tag and his knockout power, I don't think I'll be playing him much in GPP at all. I just don't think he's a very technical fighter, and even though all of his wins have come by KO, they have been against really low-level opponents. I don't think Felipe is an elite level fighter, but he is a lot more technically and defensively sound, and I think Tafa will have a much harder time finding that KO against Felipe. However, I completely understand if you decide to put Tafa in your lineups, as at 7,600, he is saving a bit of salary, and that knockout power cannot be denied, especially in MMA where anything could happen. With that being said, though, I'm just not high on Tafa at all, and I could be completely wrong about him, but I just don't think he's a very technical fighter. He's very slow and plodding and really just has that knockout power going for him. So for those reasons, I likely will be avoiding Tafa for GPP and definitely cash. I just think there are a lot of other better underdogs who can likely cash and either get the knockout or submission or even the win. So Tafa is most likely a fade for me. Felipe, on the other hand, I believe is a viable GPP and cash play, probably a stronger cash play than GPP. Felipe hasn't really shown knockout power, but against a low-level striker like Tafa, I think he should be able to land quite a bit on him. His volume isn't too bad. He should be able to score pretty well against Tafa if the fight stays standing. What I do really like about Felipe is he does like to go to the body, and over the course of a fight that will start to wear on Tafa. It'll start to tire him out. He'll start to drop his hands and start to leave his head open for the KO. And while Felipe hasn't really shown KO power, I think that against a lower level fighter in Tafa, he is potentially live for the KO. The biggest concern I have for Felipe is his inability to get off the cage or get out of clinch situations. He has shown absolutely no urgency in getting out of those situations in previous fights. With that being said, though, I just don't think that Tafa has really been able to execute that sort of a game plan. So for that reason, I think I will take a small shot on Felipe here. So to recap, I think that if the fight stays standing, Felipe should have a good chance to score pretty well either on volume or potentially getting the KO. As for Tafa, though, I likely will be fading him for GPP and for cash. And in the next fight, we have Yanan, who's priced at 8,400 versus Joselyne Edwards, who's priced at 7,800. And for those of you unaware, I did have a bet placed on Joselyne Edwards, but that was mainly because I felt the line was way off when it opened. I do actually think this is a pretty close fight, and as far as how it will play out, I think it'll be a pretty back and forth fight. This is two low-level fighters who are largely stand-up fighters, so I think there is a shot that at both fighters, landing a lot of significant strikes on each other over the course of 15 minutes. So for that reason, I think this will be a pretty good fight to target for GPP, as I think the volume would be really high between both of these fighters. I think it's more than likely that this fight will just stay on the feet the whole time. Neither fighters are really competent on the ground, and both seem to bring quite a bit of volume in their fights. As far as how the fight plays out, though, I do slightly favor Edwards, as I do think she's the more technical and more athletic fighter. I think she'll be landing the better, cleaner shots, and she will be hitting with a lot more power, in my opinion. With that being said, though, I think Yanan will have the slight volume advantage. But at the end of the day, I think whoever wins this match could potentially score over 100 points for DFS. If I did have to pick one, though, I think I would go with Edwards just because she does save a little bit of salary, although Yanan is not a bad pick at all. This is a very close fight, and if she does win, I think she could score a lot of points. As far as cash games go, though, I am leaning more towards Edwards because of the salary savings. I think even if she does lose, she could potentially put up like 30 or 40 points, which won't absolutely kill a lineup, especially for cash. So to recap, I think this is a really good fight to target for GPP and for cash, just because of the volume upside that both of these fighters bring to the table, and they're not really going to kill your salary either. So very, very good options for GPP and for cash. And in the next fight, we have Nassourdine Imavov, who's priced at 7,400 versus Phil Hawes, who's priced at 8,800. And I think both of these fighters are very much GPP viable. And the reason I say that is because Hawes does have knockout power and has gotten 5 first round KOs in a row. However, if he doesn't get that first round KO, he has shown to gas after that first round, and that's when I believe Imavov will be live for the KO himself. Imavov does have a really nice jab and a really accurate straight right, so if Hawes isn't able to get Imavov out of there in that first round, I think Imavov could very well land clean on Hawes, as Hawes will start to tire from all the power shots he throws. And for that reason, I am slightly leaning more towards Imavov, mainly because of the salary savings and because he does seem to be pretty tough. I don't think Hawes will have an easy time getting him out of there, and if he gets out of that first round, I think Nassourdine has a really good shot at either getting the KO or the sub. Hawes does have a wrestling background, and I suspect that outside of that first round, if he isn't able to get Imavov out of there, he might shoot for a panic takedown, and that could leave him exposed to a submission. And as far as submissions go, I do think Imavov has a pretty sneaky submission game. He has a number of submissions on his record, and in his last fight, he was able to snatch up the neck of Jordan Williams when he left it exposed. So if Hawes isn't careful, he could very well find himself in a very, very compromising situation. So for GPP, I think both guys are viable because they both likely can get the finish. However, I'm leaning more towards the Imavov side because of the salary savings. As far as cash games go, though, I don't think I'll be playing Hawes at all because he seems very KO dependent, and I'm just not really sure how he'll perform outside of that first round. And in regards to Imavov, I don't think he's a terrible cash play. He is a good salary saver, and the only concern is if he gets starched by Hawes in the first round. But I don't think Imavov has any durability issues, so I think there's a good chance he does survive that first round and gives a good account of himself in the next 2 or 3 rounds to potentially either win the decision or even get the finish. So to recap, I think both fighters are good GPP picks, but I'm leaning a bit more on Imavov. And as far as cash games go, I would likely avoid Hawes and might consider Imavov. And in the next fight, we have Punahele Soriano, who's priced at 7,700 versus Dusko Todorovic, who's priced at 8,500. This fight does have me a little stumped from a GPP perspective, at least from Todorovic's end. I'm not 100% sure how he'll score. He has a really weird and diverse, offense. He'll box and he'll clinch up and he'll, throw in takedowns as well. So I'm just not sure which game plan he'll go to, but I suspect that if he goes towards a more grapple-heavy or clinch-heavy game plan, he could score decently well. I don't think he's going to be breaking the slate here, but I think he could score pretty well for GPP, so definitely worth considering, especially at 8,500, but I'm not sure if he'll do, crazy well. Soriano, on the other hand, does have knockout power. He has been knocking guys out on the regional scene, but they are pretty low-level guys, so I'm not sure how that will translate over to someone like Todorovic. The only concern is for Todorovic, he does hold his hands low, so if he gets caught by, like that left hook by Soriano, it could put him out. Although Todorovic has shown toughness. He did eat a clean shot from Townsend, but, was able to, walk right through that. So for that reason, I do favor Todorovic a bit more in this matchup, but I wouldn't count Soriano out. And as far as cash games go, I would likely be fading Soriano, mainly because I think there are some other, lower priced options that could potentially do better. And I just think Dusko has a very, very smothering type of fight style that can just win fights, with his clinch and his wrestling. So overall, I just think he could potentially score a lot better on the scorecards and with his control time very well on for DFS as well. And I may be a little biased since I do have a bet placed on Todorovic, but I just think that he'll be the much bigger and stronger fighter, and he'll be able to use his strength advantage to really control grappling and clinch situations. So as far as a DFS goes, I'm not really sure how well he'll score with all the control time and how much volume he'll be throwing, but I think he'll do well for cash games, possibly for GPP games. However, the only concern is if he gets caught by Soriano. So to recap, I think Soriano is a decent GPP play just for the salary and because of the KO potential, but not so much for cash games. Dusko, on the other hand, I believe is a solid cash game play and could potentially be a really solid GPP play though. And in the next fight, we have Joaquin Buckley, who's priced at 9,400 versus Alessio de Chirico, who's priced at 6,800. So I do think Buckley is a really solid GPP play, but I have a feeling he'll be really highly owned because I think he's probably one of the more recognizable names on the card and because of his recent KO victories. So there's definitely going to be some recency bias and when it comes to, people picking him for their lineups. However, I don't think you should completely avoid him just because he is highly owned because I do think Buckley does have a really good chance at scoring very, very well. Mainly because of his fight style. He, aside from the KO potential, Buckley really just pushes a really mean pace. He packs a lot of power in his punches, and he doesn't look like he really slows down. So from a DFS perspective, I think Buckley is a really, really solid pick. He has great volume and just solid KO potential. With that being said, though, De Chirico is very tough. He's never been knocked out before and has only been dropped once, and that was in his most recent fight at the last minute. So he does have quite a chin on him, but Buckley could still catch him. De Chirico hasn't really fought someone with the pressure or the power that Buckley brings to the table. And I really do like the diversity that Buckley brings with his striking. He's able to go to the legs, go to the body, and over time I think that's going to wear on De Chirico. And over the course of the fight, I think De Chirico is going to start dropping his hands, and Buckley is just going to eventually start landing clean on him. So I think Buckley does have a good shot of knocking De Chirico out, and if he doesn't though, he does bring a good pace, and over the course of 15 minutes I think he will score a good amount of points for DFS. The biggest concern for Buckley though is he does get a little sloppy defensively as the fight goes on. The volume he brings, he doesn't really let up offensively, but defensively he stops moving his head a lot and starts leaving his chin out to get cracked. And against De Chirico, that could be dangerous, who does pack quite a punch, but De Chirico hasn't really knocked anyone out in the UFC outside of his fight against Bambose, who was a really, really low-level fighter, and honestly that was from a knee, which was a little fluky. However, I don't know if I want to include De Chirico in my GPP lineups, even though he does save a ton of salary. It's just that he's very KO reliant, and if he's not able to find that KO, he's pretty much going to be an absolute dud. And against someone like Buckley, who's going to be pressuring him most of the fight, I don't see De Chirico having too many opportunities to land that KO. And as far as cash games go, I likely will be including Buckley for all the reasons I mentioned before. He just has the knockout upside and just the volume to go with it. But for De Chirico, I won't be including him at all. So to recap, I think Buckley is definitely a solid GPP play if you're okay with the ownership, and definitely a good cash play. And for me, De Chirico is pretty much a full fade. And in the next matchup, we have Santiago Ponzinibbio, who's priced at 9,300 versus Jingliang, who's priced at 6,900. And this is a very interesting matchup, but my biggest concern around Ponzinibbio is just his really long layoff time. I just don't know how he's going to look coming off that 2.5 year layoff from an injury. I think if this was a prime Ponzinibbio we were getting, he would be worth a shot for GPP just because he's out there, he's an explosive fighter. He throws a lot of power into his shots and has been getting guys out in a lot of his fights. But, with his long layoff, I just don't know if his timing will be there or if his athleticism has taken a hit at all. With that being said, though, I don't think he's a terrible play for GPP if you're willing to roll the dice on him a bit and think that maybe he hasn't lost too much of a step. But something you do want to consider, though, is Jingliang is pretty durable and, he's never been knocked out. I think he has been rocked before, but for the most part, he has a pretty solid chin. And the other concern I have for Ponzinibbio outside of his injury and time off is his potential gas tank. I don't think he necessarily gasses, but with someone like him who throws a lot of power in his shots, he has shown to slow down as the fight goes on. And that could be very dangerous against a fighter like Jingliang, who is a very dangerous counter striker. And if he's getting sloppy and slow as the fight goes on, Lee could very well get the knockout late. And to tie it all together, I think the concern really is just if the conditioning is still there after that long layoff and that the injury. So overall, I think Ponzinibbio may be worth a shot if you think that he hasn't lost too much of a step since coming off that layoff. But for me, I think I likely won't be putting him in too many GPP lineups. Lee, on the other hand, might be worth the stab at GPP because at 6,900 you will be saving a ton of salary, and I do think he is being a little overlooked in this matchup. Lee does have a very accurate and deadly straight right, so if Ponzinibbio isn't in the shape that he was in before his layoff, or if he starts to tire as the fight goes on, Lee could very well catch him late in the fight and possibly get the KO. With that being said, though, I don't think it's too likely, as I do think Ponzinibbio is the more technical fighter, but we just don't know what that layoff really has done for Ponzinibbio. And as far as cash games go, I likely will be avoiding Ponzinibbio since there's just too many question marks surrounding his long layoff, and I just don't know what shape he'll be coming in, so I'd rather just spend that money on someone who is a bit more of a safer option. And as far as Lee goes, I think there might be a situation in which you can actually include him in a cash game lineup, mainly because of the salary savings, and I think he'll be durable enough to give a good account of himself. I don't think Ponzinibbio will be able to get Lee out early, so I think even if Lee loses, he'll put up maybe 20-30 points, which isn't going to kill your lineup. And most importantly, he'll save a ton of salary. So if you have, maybe 5 other fighters that you think are really safe picks, this could be a decent strategy. I don't know how effective that is, though. I probably won't be doing that, but just something to throw out there. And in the next matchup, we have Carlos Condit, who's priced at 8,700 versus Matt Brown, who's priced at 7,500. And from a GPP perspective, I don't think I'll have any of Condit here. I just don't think he'll be doing enough on the feet to get to score you enough points to justify that price tag. And I'm not sure he'll have the KO. He'll be able to knock out Matt Brown here, even though Matt Brown is a little bit chinny at this stage in his career. But the main thing that really stood out to me was, Condit only scored 75 points against McGee in his last fight, who really just fought the way that Condit wanted to fight. And even then, he wasn't able to score that many points. And at 8,700, I don't think he'll be worth it at all. In addition to that, too, I think it's been like 7 years since Condit's not knocked anyone out. And even though Matt Brown's durability is a little questionable, I think he's really only going to get knocked out against younger, more athletic fighters who are going to be able to beat him to the punch. I don't think that'll really be the case for Condit here, who is a bit old and slow himself. He does have the power, but the explosiveness just isn't really there. Matt Brown, on the other hand, I think is viable for GPP because I do think this matchup plays out pretty close, and if he's able to keep it competitive on the feet, he could steal a decision, and at 7,500, he could save you a lot of salary for some of the other guys you want to pay up for. And as far as cash games go, I don't think I'll be putting Condit in there since, for the reasons I've explained before, I just don't think he'll pay for his price tag, even if he does win. But for Brown, I think that, he wouldn't be too bad of a play because I do believe this fight is going to take place on the feet. I don't think either guy is going to be, grappling at all. So if it stays standing, I think Brown might be able to potentially, out-volume Condit. But even if he does lose here, I think he'll score enough to not absolutely kill your lineup and at the same time, free up a bit of salary for guys you do want to pay up for. However, I think in terms of underdogs, he's still not the best pick. I think the best one is going to be one that I'll be breaking down pretty soon here. But just to recap, I don't think Condit is going to be a good play for me for GPP or for cash. And for Matt Brown, I think he'll be a viable GPP play, possibly cash game play, but I think there are some other better underdogs that you could get in your lineup. And finally, we are here at the main event headlined by Max Holloway, who is priced at 8,900 versus Calvin Kattar, who's priced at 7,300. And from a GPP perspective, I think you do have to target this fight because it is a 5-round fight, and this is largely going to be a high-volume stand-up fight, in my opinion. I do think this fight will play out very close, and I actually do favor Kattar in this matchup. So for that reason, I likely will be having Kattar in more of my lineups than Max, although I will likely have exposure in Max as well. I don't think you should stack this fight for GPP, though, because I think if Max wins, there's probably going to be some other underdogs that could potentially score better than Kattar. And if Kattar wins, I definitely don't think you want to have Max in your lineup. I think the only time stacking really works for GPP is if both guys get takedowns or knockdowns in the 5-rounder, but I don't think that'll really be the case in this fight. Neither guy is going to really implement a takedown heavy game, and I think both guys are durable and defensively sound enough to not get dropped. However, I do think that is a viable strategy for cash games if you think Max is going to win, because I do think that more than likely this will go to a decision, and even if Kattar loses, he'll probably put up some really solid numbers. But if you think Kattar is going to win, you definitely don't want Max in the lineup. He's just going to cost way too much to be putting in that lineup for cash. So with that being said, I think Kattar is just going to be a lock for me for cash games, mainly because at 7,300 he'll free up a ton of salary, and I do think this will be a 5-rounder. So there's a good chance that he'll even in a loss probably score 40-50 points, which is decent for 7,300, and will free up a ton of salary for some of my other fighters. But I actually do think Kattar is going to win. So as far as cash games go, I'm probably going to have him in pretty much all my lineups for cash. So to recap, I think this is going to be a highly targeted fight for GPP, and I think both guys are viable for that. However, for cash games, I think Kattar is going to be pretty much a lock across the board for me. And that will do it for the DFS breakdown. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. This is my first DFS breakdown podcast, so let me know if there's anything I could touch up on, and I'll be happy to address that in the next installment. But until then, stay safe and best of luck.